Hello and welcome back. I'm Octavius Obe. Today, my guest is a very special person, Liberia's former ambassador to the United States, Her Excellency, Ambassador Rachael Gbenyon Deeks. Before serving as our ambassador near Washington, D.C., she was at the World Bank from 1981 to 1991. She was a research analyst in the International Relations Department and subsequently was transferred to the Division of Strategic Planning for the bank. Uh, she also owned and operated a very popular business in Washington, D.C., Tasteful Catering. Ambassador, welcome to the program.
It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, and let me summarize some of the areas we'll be looking at today. We'll talk about your work at the bank, of course, your ambassadorship and the catering business. And I also want to look at the life and the historical context of the passing of your brother, the famous journalist Charles Gbenyon. He passed in the early days of the coup in 1980, I believe. But let's go back and tell us about yourself. Which part of Liberia were you born?
I was born in Edina, Grand Bassa County,
Okay.
the greatest city and one of the founding counties of Liberia.
Okay. And what was life like around the time you grew up and you were born in Edina?
Very rural. Edina, growing up, we did not have a clinic, a hospital, uh, no electricity. Uh, we did a lot. We survived as an agrarian society. Everything you ate was planted or grown by your family. That was the Liberia. What we did have is that we had numerous churches, which instilled in us one of my favorite sayings, do unto others as you would they do unto you. So we grew up in a close-knitted community. And we had, now I realize, one of the premier school systems, elementary school systems in the country. I gathered that after I transferred from the Edina Government Day School to St. Teresa's Convent in Monrovia.
So you get to convent in Monrovia. I did some background work. I hear you were a pretty good student.
Yes, my daddy made sure of that. I remember once bringing my grades home from the convent, and I wasn't a very good math student, but I had 100 in all of my subjects and a 90 in math, and got a real good scolding that I didn't have a job. My only job was to study. Life was hard. Why did I get a 90 in math? But when I left Edina Government School and went to the convent, I had just been promoted to the 6th grade in Edina. And when I got to the convent and did the entrance exam, they put me into the 7th grade. And then when they tried the 7th grade, they put me into the 8th grade, and I graduated from elementary school at the age of 11 and from convent high school at the age of 15.
Did you go to the University of Liberia after graduating from convent?
I did. I went to the university for a year, and then my dad got assigned to a diplomatic post in Italy, so we transferred to Europe.
So you get to Italy, and then what did you go to university in Italy?
I could not, because at the time in Europe you could only enter university at age 18, and at 16 I wasn't allowed. So my dad arranged for me to go to um, a finishing school in Lucerne, Switzerland, as if I were unfinished. And but because I was interested in languages, he thought that I could do both French and German, because I at the Institute of St. Agnes. And when I was 18, I transferred to the University of Geneva School of Interpreters.
So you were or are an interpreter by training.
I'm an interpreter by training.
Okay. So you finished there. At what point did you come back to Liberia to live as an
I
adult?
came back to Liberia uh, in 1971, but I was working at the UN in Geneva with the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And the Liberian itch had grabbed me, so I decided to give up a lifetime job where I would have been a retiree at 50 and go back to Liberia.
So you come back to Liberia and you go to work for Steve Talbot as his chief of staff. Put that into context. What was it like? And the obvious question to ask about anything Talbot related is, did he get his money from his brother who was president at the time?
I went back to Liberia with the intention of going into business, nothing to do with government. But I was bullied into into working for Steve Talbot, because at the time I was living with my brother-in-law, Julius Cooper, who was Minister of Action for Development and Progress, a new agency. And Steve said he was looking for someone who had some international experience, and also who could train a staff that would run the, as we called it, the ninth floor. So, and that was how I was bullied. I agreed to go for 1 year, and the 1 year lasted 3 years. The second part.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The second part of the story about Steve Talbot is, I think it grounded me into history, politics, and the potential of Liberia. People always, when people used to bring up the argument, oh, he got the money from his brother, and which is not true. But he did confess to me, I didn't get the money from my brother, but I got into the Mesorado group through the government of Liberia. When he served as Minister of Agriculture, he had commissioned a UNDP study on how to increase the protein intake for young children, because many people could not afford to eat, but fish was very, very cheap in Liberia, and they wanted to incorporate fish more heavily into the Liberian diet. But the government did not think that was a viable project. And he told me when he was leaving, when he got fired as Minister of Agriculture, he took that study with him. And based on that study, he started the Mesoredo fishing with some local fishermen, and that expanded into the Mesoredo group of companies.
I'm going to come over to the Mesoredo group of companies here shortly, but you used an expression that I'm still finding it difficult to connect in my mind. You said the ninth floor. What was that?
The ninth floor was the minister's office.
Okay.
Yeah.
He was Minister of Finance at the time.
He was Minister of Finance at the time.
Okay. And so, Chief of Staff, you were working on the government side, or was it on the private business side of Mr. Tolbert?
Solely on the government side.
Okay.
Trying to learn what was happening in government, trying to figure out what improvements could be made, because they were anxious to make as many improvements as they could in the shortest possible time. And that was my job. It was a terrible job, and it was the best job I've had in my life, because there was nothing that Steve Tolbert signed that when I was there that did not have my initials on the bottom. So that was a big, big responsibility. I said, why don't you do? He says, because I can always blame it on you that Diggs put this. Diggs put this on my desk. So, but it was a very, very enriching experience, because we traveled quite a bit, took many risks with our lives, using small Cessna planes to go across Africa constantly on a flight to Europe or to Asia or to the Middle East, trying to impress on the world that Liberia had offered a lot to world development and could still continue if given the chance.
And so you as Chief of Staff to the Minister of Finance, Steve Tolbert at the time, you would know about how much money we owed internationally in terms of our debt obligations, the frequency of payments, and all of that. Did we ever renege on any debt during those days?
Never. Liberia had a stellar debt-paying record. In fact, Liberia and the Ivory Coast were the only two countries at that time who qualified for what they call hard loans, IBRD loans from the World Bank. But more impressive than financing our debt service, and we had a special bureau was set up in the Ministry of Finance to handle debt servicing, was the decision of the Tolberts to have $2 million deposited every month from government revenue into local banks for small borrowers who did not have any collateral, because if you wanted to borrow from any of the big banks at the time, Bank of Monrovia or any of those banks, you had to have some property, and a lot of the businesses or a lot of business people did not have, were not property owners. And that gave a great boost to the Liberian economy. More people wanted not to work for government, but to get their small loans and
start businesses. So I recall there was a meeting between World Bank President Robert McNamara and Steve Tolbert. You were involved in that. How did it go? What were the circumstances, and how did that meeting impact Liberia as a whole, in your view?
Uh, One of the things is, behold what my eyes have seen, uh, as as finance minister of Liberia. You had you served as a governor on the at the World Bank, and we came for some meetings, and the focus of that meeting was the road construction in Liberia. And the World Bank had agreed to finance highways, and we were insisting that they include farm to market roads and maintenance, because they would build the roads would deteriorate, but there wasn't a maintenance component in the. So Steve thought that if he had a heart-to-heart talk with the president of the bank, we could improve the contents of that road project loan. So he asked that Bob McNamara come to his house for breakfast. And I remember George Cooper, who was head of the financial office, trembled when he was told that he needed to make that arrangement. But it happened, and McNamara showed up at Steve Talbot's little house in Silver Spring. We spread country called lapa on the floor, and we served a typical Liberian breakfast: cassava, smoked fish gravy, cornbread, rice bread, and they had a good meeting, and it was a meeting of the minds, and we did get the farm to market roads and a maintenance component into that, to our next road project in Liberia.
And that was my next question. Beyond pleasantries, country club and cassava gravy and all of that, how did that meeting impact Liberia, short term at the time and long term, you think?
Well, it established a good friendship, and I think that Bob McNamara may not have gone to any other minister of finance house but Steve Talbot enjoyed so much respect internationally from the building of the Mesorado group. Mesorado had branches in Sierra Leone, in Nigeria. Most of the fish that was processed here in the United States for Vanderkamp came from the Mesorado group. And Mesorado also had an international branch called Freelex in London. And most of all, at the time, for an African company to have a Dun & Bradstreet AAA rating was laudable. Mm-hmm. So I guess all of the curiosity, let me meet this guy one-on-one and see if all the hoopla around him is real or if it is. And I think that established a strong friendship between Steve Talbot and Bob McNamara.
So there's another view about the relationship between the World Bank and developing countries that borrow money from the bank. Professor Perkins has written a book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, in which he argues that the role of the bank is to really ensure the domination of the West over developing countries. And you take out all these monies, loans, and even if you're not able to pay it back, then they come and start to make demands on you. If you agree, you continue to be their guy, so to speak. But if you don't agree, then you have some political and problems. Do you think our relationship with the World Bank somehow impacted the trajectory of Liberia in international relations?
Well, I can tell you in American parlance that what the World Bank did or does now is, they would say in good American English, that's business. But as we know, all business,
You are being diplomatic now, though.
all business is not good business.
Okay.
And for an institution like the World Bank, who would design a project for an African country, they would supervise and appraise the project. And at the end of the project, if it was not successful, the country would still be stuck with the loan. And if I got a contractor to build my house, design my house, build it, supervise it, appraise it, and then the house falls down, I think that there should be some mechanism of blaming, of some of the blame or most of the blame being on the construction company. And but the African countries want so much to belong to that club because it is a prestigious club, and the way it's set up is like we set up here with credit rating in the United States. If you were not a member, your credit rating counted around the world. So most of the African countries stay with those institutions because of that. They've had tremendous projects, but most of the projects are not designed by the African countries.
Mm-hmm. So if the projects were not or are not designed by African countries, and there are a failure somewhat subsequently, you're arguing that some of the blame should fall back onto the shoulders of the World Bank. Now, let me ask for a further clarification, not just conceptually, but in terms of hard currency, in terms of money. Are you saying that the World Bank should then write off some of the loans that they gave and they were responsible for implementing?
I should think, or at least there should be some mechanism of arbitration, because a lot of the projects is not that the Africans they sign off on it, so they hold a responsibility. But a lot of their ideas and options are not included in many of the projects that are carried out. But it's also prestigious to know that there are some World Bank projects being ongoing in your country. So a lot of them do that.
So tell me the story again for the audience about the poverty alleviation and poverty eradication. I thought it was a very interesting story.
Well, I tell you, I was this time I was a World Bank employee, and we were trying to write the poverty reduction strategy for the world, for countries overall. And well, because Africa came up as the most, it was called the Africa Study. And in that study, in one of the first drafts was that they would eradicate poverty in Africa. And at one meeting, I remember a staffer saying, eradicate poverty? How would we buy our designer suits? And I guess that was supposed to be a joke, but then the eradication was changed to alleviation in that report. Mm-hmm. And I took it, being a diplomat, I would say one hand must rub, you need both hands to wash your hand, one hand rub the other. So if you got poverty alleviation mm-hmm. and not eradication, both sides got something from the relationship.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So you left the bank, and in the DC area, your house became a sort of a popular meeting place when you established Tasteful Catering.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
Well, Tasteful Catering came to me as an idea when I worked at the World Bank. I think I may have just the kitchen is my happy place. I love people. I love to cook. I love to entertain. And we used to have all of these functions at the World Bank that you would ask office, could you fix this or that? And anytime I prepared a dish, someone would come and ask me for the recipe, or when they, you must have Rachael's fish or chicken or something at the table. And it came to me, wow, if I could have the World Bank as my niche, I could open a company, cook and feed them, and that would be on my own time. My life would be more my own. So that was the idea. So when I hosted a retirement party for myself and invited a few of the dignitaries of the bank, and from that retirement party, I got 2 contracts. Well, at least one was for a wedding and one was for just an ordinary lunch. So having the World Bank as my niche for establishing the business was a lucrative thing.
Mm-hmm. So being in the DC area with the bank, the retirement party, you said the kitchen is your happy place. That's your niche. At some point, the business grew into a meeting place for Liberians in the DC area.
Yeah, well, that was the offshoot of Tasteful Catering, because usually weekends would be the time for when you would have events. People always wanted events on the weekend, but my house was usually filled with a crowd of friends who would come. So I decided that, this could be a good income gathering event. So I called it Saturday Market, where we only had Liberian food. It was for the Liberian community, and we put on dance, music, socialize, and I believe that was a place where Liberians united, because all of the years I've been in Nashville for 22 years, and I still get calls from people telling me how much they miss Saturday Market. So
you come from the bank, you establish the business, Tasteful Catering, the offshoot Saturday Market. You're successful, you're pretty well known in the DC area. How did you, first of all, meet Charles Taylor to subsequently become Liberia's ambassador to the United States?
Well, as I say, cooking and creations in the kitchen, my happy place, and I guess that was why I got to meet Charles Taylor after the 1997 election was held and the international community declared that it was fair and free. I had not been back to Liberia for 17 years, and a very good friend of mine who had worked with Taylor lived in the United States but went back because she saw some purpose to what he was fighting for. We were at odds about the purpose, but she asked if I could use my skills because there wasn't any money in the coffers for the inauguration events, cooking, and she thought that I had used some of the local produce in Liberia to create dishes that were palatable, and asked me to go to Liberia and help. And my condition was I would come, but I would not meet with Charles Taylor.
Why did you not want to meet him? And
Because the war had brought such devastation to Liberia. Yes, the coup brought a lot of devastation, but the coup was against a targeted group. The war engulfed the whole country, and I was of the opinion that we could have solved the problem differently. And I may have been wrong because the war showed that Liberians are resilient and that they are survivors.
okay.
So I guess that's the one good lesson we took from that. But I understand now that the after effects after all of these years it has destroyed our country.
Okay, so let's go back to the question I asked earlier. You get to Monrovia, you're helping out. How did you meet Taylor? How did you become ambassador?
Well, yes, well, it was the night before my return to the United States that my friend thought that, well, that she didn't think it would be good for her to have a house guest, and being as close as she was to Taylor, that I didn't even get to pay my respects. That was what the parlance that was used in the place. You haven't paid your respect. And apparently, since Liberia is such a small society, she was asked on many occasions, I hear you have a house guest and I haven't met your house guest. So I agreed that I would go and pay my respects. And to my shock and to my friend's shock, when I was ushered into his office, he said, so you've seen the country like it is? I said, yes. Are you going to do anything to help? And I don't know whether I was being flippant or not. Say, I run a business in the United States, but if there's anything I can do from Washington to help, I would be willing, because I see the conditions in the country. And the next question shocked me to my core. Well, I know something that you can do. You can serve as the next Liberian ambassador, because I hear you worked a lot to get sanctions imposed on the country. And if you know how to get them imposed, you may have some ideas of how to get them lifted. Followed by We don't have a functioning embassy because the residence is in disrepair. The chancery has been burned down. We don't have, and as a joke said, I understand they stole the one diplomatic car from the embassy and the rogues brought it back the next day, the ambassador's car to Washington and parked it. And then, and we don't have any money to pay a salary. So, but if we get things in order, we will get there and you will get some compensation. So that was the challenge. And I thought that my family would not agree. So I said, well, I'll consult with my family. And when I called my husband, he was saying, the way you describe the country, you cannot not leave and not help. So that's the story behind Rachael Diggs getting the nod to serve as the post-war ambassador to Washington, D.C.
So I'm going to comment. We'll come and discuss your tenure, but you said something very revealing in Mr. Taylor's comments to you. You said that he said to you, you've worked hard in getting sanctions imposed, and so you will perhaps know how to get them lifted. And I don't know if you disagree with him or not, but was that statement accurate? Did you get sanctions imposed on Liberia? If so, why?
Well, it wasn't a one-man thing, but it was a united front in Liberia that we would protest, we would lobby the Congress, we would do everything we could as citizens to get some order restored to Liberia. And we thought at the time that that sanctions were the most effective tools to use for that. So in that he was correct. I remember one of my bosses at the World Bank called me in once and said, I think Liberia is getting you into troubles. I said, it always has gotten me into trouble. But why? And he says, every time I ask for you, say you are called to a rally. And I did participate in many of the rallies for having sanctions imposed if no order was brought back to the country.
So you accept the request and you are subsequently appointed ambassador. In the beginning, what was it like?
You're taking me back into the dark days. The first day I entered the makeshift, because at the time the chancery was burned, but they were using one of the properties on Colorado Avenue to conduct government business. I sat at the desk for a minute and I ran into the restroom and threw up.
Why?
The desk was broken. The holes in the chairs at the embassy. There were raccoons living in the attic. There were families who had worked for the embassy, but because they hadn't been paid, lived in the building. And this was what I was supposed to present as a face of Liberia to my host country.
Mm.
The next day, I came back to the embassy with several of my lapas and tied them around the chairs. I brought my bucket, my mop, my broom, my ironing board, my iron, and washed and cleaned whatever. The staff did join me. It looked like a novelty, and few friends had bought a few plants, and it didn't shine, but it began to look like a, a possibility of what Liberia could become.
So you
And
get in there, you do your basic cleaning,
that,
housekeeping. At some point, you must have presented your letters of credence to the sitting president at the time. I believe it was President Clinton, right?
yes. Well, the first step in an ambassadorship is that you present your credentials first with a meeting with the Secretary of State. But I understand that Madeleine Albright had set the order down that she would not meet with any Charles Taylor ambassador. So I didn't get that privilege to present to her, but I presented to one of the deputies. And once you do that, then they set a time and a day for you to present to the president in the Oval Office. And that happened in about a month later. I say that the Secretary of State would not meet with a Charles Taylor ambassador. We showed the uphill battle that I had to climb, but say, as Charles Taylor says, if you have sanctions imposed, you must know how to get them removed. So
what did you do to remove those sanctions?
Well, I wouldn't say it was single-handedly, but I made a lot of good friends with staffers on the Hill, which would be my advice to anybody, because people think it's the lawmakers that write the decisions, but they are the staffers who draft them. And I started a bi-weekly meeting with staffers from both sides to give
Both sides meaning Republicans and Democrats.
Republican and Democrats.
Okay.
To explain to them the history of Liberia and Liberia's role in the in global activities. As small a country as we had, Liberia was a founding member of the UN. Liberia was the deciding vote on the creation of the State of Israel. Liberia lawyers had written a lot of the maritime laws of the sea. Liberian lawyers were involved in setting up international labor laws, and many of them did not have that history of Liberia. I also called us, and when I say us, people who are considered having American heritage, who were ex-slaves, that we were the people who had the double whammy. We were forced out of the United States because people did not want blacks working, studying, and Liberia was found as a haven, and then they were thrown out of Liberia in with the 1980 coup because people at that end looked at them as the oppressor. So many of us we don't know our ancestry. From my mother's side, my dad is an indigenous.
So at some point you get your day in court, so to speak, for lack of a better terminology, a very undiplomatic choice of words there on my part. But you get to meet with the Americans, and they present to you a to-do list of things you need to do to sort of normalize relations.
Well, they didn't volunteer. I asked for it because every time I met at the State Department or was called in was for some issue that they had. So I suggested that if they gave me what I called a homework list, a list of all the issues they wanted resolved, that I would proceed with that with my government and see where we could have a meeting of the minds. And I was giving that homework list and was very proud when my foreign minister, Mooney Captain, I walked into the U.S. State Department and they told us that the list was complete. We had that meeting with Ambassador Pickering, who was then one of the deputies at the U.S. Department of State. And he said this would set Liberia-U.S. relations on a new footing. So that was a very, very happy and prideful day. Unfortunately, the next day, when the papers came out, it came out saying that Charles Taylor was the mastermind behind the Sierra Leone war. And that took me aback because I thought that if that did not headline my homework sheet, at least it should have been included somewhere in it.
So that took you by surprise. You thought that.
It took me by surprise. It more than surprise. This is one of the things, it shook me to my core.
So you still were able to get over that hurdle, though, because at some point you sort of organized a visit of Mr. Taylor to the United States.
Yes, and that was against all odds. But, you know, in Washington is a city where you hear in the place, I will use some of my chips. And I think my experience with the World Bank and interacting with some of the officials, I had built up a few chits because the State Department was adamant that Taylor would not come to the United States. This I termed was a working visit. But the hurdle I had to clear before starting the process of preparing the visit was to get the whole Plymouth escape from prison resolved. So I made a few trips to Massachusetts, a visit to the prison, which maybe Houdini may have been able to get out of there without help, but I didn't see how. And anyway, we had a hearing with the sheriff at the time, and we had a court hearing, and the judge issued a nolle prosequi. And many Liberians do not know that this case had been tried because Taylor the charges were that he had embezzled $1 million from the Liberian government. and they had asked for him
to
to
be
be
extradited.
extradited.
Mm-hmm.
Now, an extradition request, as far as my research showed, does not put you in a maximum security prison in the United States. And Plymouth was a maximum security prison. So that was the first hurdle.
Okay,
Why?
let's come back to the hurdles here in a little bit. But for
Mhm.
ordinary people listening, you said the case was declared what? Nolle prosequi. In everyday
Yes,
English, what does that mean?
that means that no merit. It was dismissed.
So the case against Taylor, in regards to the extradition, was dismissed.
It had been tried in court, and the Liberian government lost. But Taylor was still held in prison at
Why?
the time. Well, that you will have, but he's dead now. Chicken Scott was the government lawyer at the time, and the case was lost. So I don't know how or why, but I know when I went through the process and got it to the judge, they too were astonished that the case had been tried and lost by the Liberian government, but Taylor was still held in prison.
You said something about only Houdini being able to escape from that prison. You had a meeting with the sheriff and people who ran the prison at the time, presumably. What did you learn, and are you able to say anything about how he escaped that prison?
No, I don't know. All I could get was that he had help, but what help, no one knows. I mean, some of them were saying that the help were from Liberians, but if we could find those Liberians today, we could set Liberia on the right foot.
Okay, so you get everything lined up, you get all your ducks in order, so to speak, for Taylor to come and visit the United States. He did not visit the United States. What happened?
Well, I understand that he was put under pressure. Working in Liberia today, that's the mistake we made, that, oh, this is not how we do it. But if we don't find new ways to do things in Liberia, we will be a lost people. I say this because if an ambassador is planning a presidential trip, you would usually ask the government for funding. You would usually work, but these were unusual circumstances because if the host government was adamant and you went through the regular channels, you would always get a hard no. So framing this as a business for a country that had contributed so much to the world, business-wise, with Firestone, with all of the steel that the U.S. used that were taken from Bumi and Bong and Limba, all of those places, I felt that we were owed at least a hearing. And I went off the beaten path through getting the approvals and things from my government. And then when I didn't ask for any funds to arrange this visit, I think I ruffled some feathers. And my advice to the president, usually when a presidential visit, you bring a boatload or a plane load of people. And my recommendation was to travel only with the foreign minister and the finance minister, since we had arranged meetings with the World Bank, the IMF, editorial boards, had sold out the press club, National Press Club in Washington, D.C., because the reporters were anxious to meet this character who was Charles Taylor, because that was how he was displayed. So it didn't. I was shocked again when I got to the embassy in the morning and said that the president had canceled his trip to the United States for pressing domestic matters. So my call was not very diplomatic to my president. I felt that he had offered a disrespect not only to the ambassador, but to the Liberian people, because I felt that this visit could have shifted the views of what people thought about Liberia. We're not a war-torn, warring country. Everywhere we want peace, we want development, we want to live normal, average life. And that was the message I got, and I thought that he would bring to the United States, but it didn't happen, and I offered my resignation.
Okay. But the prevailing thinking at the time was that if he had come to the United States, he would have been captured and potentially incarcerated. And that's why he didn't come, right?
Well, it may have been, but that added to the sting, to my sting, and said, he really doesn't know this. He really didn't know of me, because I would have laid my life down before I have my president arrested in any country. So to come to my post and be arrested, and I had worked so hard and paid so many visits to Massachusetts and wanted everything done by the book. So that would have never happened.
Let's pivot and wind up the conversation by talking about your brother, your late brother, Charles Gbenyon. The circumstances surrounding his death is pretty well known. He was a journalist at the Liberian Broadcasting System, went out to cover events, and was subsequently killed. Without going into minutiae, just as a family, how, of course, they impacted you. So the proper question to ask would be, can you put his passing in a context in regards to Liberia as a whole?
Well, as I just told you, that if the Liberian people or the President Taylor did not know how we were built as Lawrence Gbenyon's children. We were built. My dad dedicated his life in building strong people. We were not a wealthy family. We were not a rich family. And Charles' death showed us our mettle, what we were made of, because I don't think any other Liberian would have gone to work that day after the incident. Would have said it struck me. But I wanted the Liberian people, and that was the time to hear their voices, that are journalists bringing them daily news in the place could be treated so despicably, so horribly, and that did not raise their conscience to organize a protest in Charles's honor. He would have died doing his job, and that was how we were built. Taken to the mansion, and we have tips. We got the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights and protection for journalists and all of them, and He was brutally murdered. And when my dad asked for his body, we only wanted, give me a minute.
Okay. Take your time.
We only wanted a space where we could visit with him. My dad walked alone to the executive mansion with a letter asking for his remains. And until today, we don't know where he is. Whether he was buried, whether he was thrown out with the trash, whether he was dumped into the sea, we still don't know, but he left us two great gifts, a son and a daughter who, despite the trauma of growing up without a dad and knowing your dad's end was so brutal, they are making us, our hearts filled with pride because they're doing very well. And I guess that would be his legacy.
So, as someone from your generation, you are just a few years older than I am. So, one of the things I like to do on the program is to draw a line or connect the dots between, I should say, among your generation, my generation, and those who are coming after me, and see if there are lessons that we can learn or pass on to me and then me on, or through me onto the younger generation.
Well, what comes to me as a shock is how little the generations who come after us. I'll be 82 years old in a few months.
My father said never ask a lady for her age, but anyway.
Well, I've earned my stars, and I'm not going to give them to anybody else. The age is a stage. And the onus is on us. I think that is where we failed you generations. We did not talk to you enough about Liberia's history. We did not talk to you enough about pride in country. We did not, and we may have given you the impression, because we came from very hard days, that giving things and building wealth was a priority, or could become a priority. Building people is what sustains a nation. And our parents' generation made sure that they built people who were proud of their nation, and they told us stories. Many of us in my age group, we decided to expand the horizons of our children. We sent them abroad to school, and what they learned, instead of bringing that knowledge to enhance what they had, they brought that knowledge to create an imitation. And we know that an imitation is never the real thing. And I feel that is the problem. When I hear young children say, oh, I grew up poor, I never had shoes. Well, welcome to the club. In the President William R. Talbot will tell you that he had one pair of good shoes, and our only Sunday. Every day you went to school without shoes. When I hear them, oh, it's too far to walk. In my generation, we who lived on Crown Hill walked to St. Teresa's Convent every day. Rainy season, we wrapped our dry clothes in a plastic bag, and when we got to school, we toweled down and put on the dry clothes. Uh, I wouldn't say that we were starving or we didn't have food to eat, because when you came from school, you were obliged to work in your family garden. Every family had a garden where you grew something. So if you woke up and said, I don't have anything to eat, it was not your parents' fault. It was not. You grew what you eat, and that is it. And we didn't pass that value on to King. And I see that the new generation feels that the more things you have, the more important things you have, the more important culture you have is what will determine how great a country can become. And that is fictional.
Wow. So that's a very good note to end on. Summarily, it's more important to develop people as opposed to acquiring things. My guest today, Rachael Gbenyon Deeks, a former research analyst at the World Bank, Liberia's former ambassador to these United States, and of course, the proprietor of Tasteful Catering. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been my pleasure and my honor. And I hope we've sent a few lessons to young Liberians, because the fate of the country is in their hands, and it should be in their hearts too.